The humid Manila evening wrapped around the grand ballroom of the Makati Shangri-La like a warm embrace, crystal chandeliers casting golden light over the city's elite. Outside, jeepneys honked through traffic while street vendors called out their wares. But inside this sanctuary of marble and silk, the Philippines' most powerful gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala. The scent of sampaguita flowers mixed with expensive perfumes as politicians, celebrities, and business moguls mingled beneath towering windows that framed the glittering skyline. Waiters in crisp white barongs weaved through clusters of guests, carrying trays of champagne and canapes, their soft footsteps muffled by Persian rugs. The gentle hum of Tagalog and English conversations filled the air, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter and the soft clink of crystal glasses. This was where Manila's dreams took shape, where handshakes sealed million-peso deals, and where the future of Filipino children hung in the balance of tonight's donations. Senator Manny Pacquiao stood near the auction display, his small frame almost lost among the towering politicians and businessmen surrounding him. His simple black suit, pressed but unremarkable, contrasted sharply with the designer tuxedos and diamond-studded gowns of his companions. He listened intently as Dr. Maria Santos, the foundation's director, explained how tonight's funds would build schools in Mindanao, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose millions of Filipinos had seen before championship fights. The fluorescent lights caught the small scars above his eyebrows, tiny reminders of battles fought in rings around the world, while his eyes, still sharp and focused, tracked every detail of the presentation. Despite his global fame and political position, he carried himself with the same humble demeanor that had endeared him to his people, nodding respectfully at each person who approached for a photo or handshake. The weight of representation never left his shoulders. Here, as everywhere, he was not just Manny Pacquiao, but the embodiment of every Filipino's dream. The ballroom's atmosphere shifted subtly when Seagal made his entrance through the main doors, his imposing 6'4" frame cutting through the crowd like a ship through calm waters. His jet-black hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and his dark suit was tailored to perfection. But it was his presence, that Hollywood aura of manufactured mystique, that turned heads and hushed conversations. Cameras flashed as society photographers captured his arrival, while whispers rippled through the crowd in multiple languages. "That's Steven Seagal, the action star. He's bigger in person." The actor moved with deliberate slowness, his hands clasped in front of him in a martial arts pose that seemed more performance than natural stance. Hotel staff rushed to accommodate his small entourage, while guests pulled out phones to record his every move, the excitement palpable in the tropical air that drifted through the ballroom's open terraces. The two men's paths converged near the silent auction tables, where framed jerseys and boxing gloves sat beside pieces of Filipino art and jewelry donations. Seagal was examining a vintage Rolex when someone in his group pointed toward Pacquiao, and the actor's eyes followed the gesture with obvious curiosity. The space between them, maybe 20 feet of polished marble, seemed to shrink as other guests sensed the potential for an encounter between these two vastly different legends. Camera phones discreetly rose as society reporters positioned themselves for the perfect angle, while the general murmur of conversation took on an expectant quality. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but the tropical heat seemed to intensify as these two worlds, one built on authentic achievement, the other on cinematic illusion, prepared to collide in the most unexpected of settings. Neither man yet knew that this chance meeting would become the defining moment of the evening, captured and shared across social media within minutes. The introduction came through a mutual acquaintance, a wealthy businessman who collected celebrity encounters like trophies in his Makati penthouse. "Stephen, meet Senator Pacquiao." You know, the boxer, he said, with the casual air of someone accustomed to orchestrating such meetings. Seagal extended a large hand, his grip firm but theatrical, while cameras continued to flash around them like lightning in the humid evening air. The crowd pressed closer, sensing the electricity of this unexpected pairing, their hushed conversations creating a backdrop of anticipation. Manny accepted the handshake with his characteristic humility, his calloused fighter's hands dwarfed by Seagal's larger grip. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with the faint aroma of adobo drifting from the kitchen, while overhead fans stirred the thick Manila air. This was the moment when two different definitions of strength would collide in the most public way possible. "So you're the famous Manny Pacquiao," Seagal said, his voice carrying that familiar drawl that had narrated countless action sequences. His tone held a subtle condescension that made several nearby guests shift uncomfortably, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. "I've seen some of your fights on television. Interesting technique," he continued, the word interesting delivered with a slight smirk that didn't reach his eyes. The businessman who'd made the introduction sensed the tension immediately, his smile faltering as he realized his social coup was taking an uncomfortable turn. Manny maintained his diplomatic composure, nodding politely despite the obvious slight, his years in politics having taught him to read between carefully chosen words. The ballroom's golden light seemed to dim slightly as conversations around them grew quieter, guests straining to hear every word. The tropical evening breeze through the open terrace doors carried the distant sounds of Manila traffic, a reminder of the real world beyond this gilded cage. The crowd grew thicker as word spread that something significant was happening between the two celebrities near the auction tables. Smartphones appeared like flowers after rain, their screens glowing as social media posts began flooding Facebook and Instagram with real-time updates. "You know," Seagal continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical, "I've been training in martial arts for over 40 years. Real combat, not just dancing around in shorts." The comment landed like a physical blow, causing audible gasps from several onlookers who understood the insult embedded in his words. A prominent Manila socialite clutched her pearl necklace, while a young reporter frantically typed notes on her phone, recognizing a story that would make headlines. The air conditioning seemed inadequate against the rising tension, as expensive perfumes mixed with the nervous perspiration of witnesses to an unfolding drama. Even the waiters slowed their pace, sensing that history was being written between the crystal champagne flutes and designer gowns. Seagal's voice carried across the marble floors as he delivered his most cutting observation. "Boxing is just hitting and getting hit. Any tough guy from the street can do that." The words hung in the perfumed air like smoke from a fired gun. While the crowd collectively held its breath in stunned silence, cameras clicked rapidly as society photographers captured Manny's reaction, his face remaining composed despite the public humiliation being heaped upon him. The businessman who'd orchestrated the meeting looked mortified, realizing his social event was becoming an international incident that would be dissected across Filipino social media within hours. A waiter carrying a tray of canapes froze mid-step, his eyes wide as he witnessed the Hollywood star's casual destruction of their national hero's reputation. The sounds of Manila's evening rush hour continued outside, but inside this ballroom, time seemed suspended as everyone waited for the boxing legend's response. The weight of 8 division world championships and a nation's pride settled on Manny's shoulders like a familiar training robe. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant hum of Manila traffic and the soft whir of air conditioning overhead. Manny's weathered hands remained clasped behind his back, his posture unchanged despite the public humiliation echoing through the marble corridors of the ballroom. His dark eyes, which had stared down champions in rings from Las Vegas to Macau, now held a quiet intensity that made several onlookers step back instinctively. The scent of sampagita flowers seemed stronger now, mixing with the nervous energy radiating from the crowd of Manila's elite who had gathered to witness this unprecedented confrontation. A society reporter held her breath, her manicured finger hovering over her phone's record button, sensing that whatever came next would define both men's legacies. The golden chandeliers cast dancing shadows across Pacquiao's face as he processed the insult with the same calculated patience he'd used to study opponents' weaknesses. This was the moment when the people's champion would either walk away or remind everyone why he'd earned that title. "Mr. Seagal," Manny began, his voice soft but carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, each word measured like precise jabs in a championship bout. His Visayan accent colored the English words with the authenticity of someone who had never forgotten his roots in General Santos City. "I understand you have great skill in martial arts, and I respect that. We are both students of combat in our own ways." The crowd leaned forward collectively, recognizing the diplomatic opening that had become Pacquiao's trademark in both politics and sports. A waiter carrying crystal champagne flutes slowed his pace, unwilling to miss whatever was about to unfold between these two legends. The tropical evening air seemed to thicken as expensive perfumes mixed with the perspiration of anticipation, while smartphone screens glowed like fireflies in the dimmed lighting. His humility in the face of such public disrespect only made the assembled crowd respect him more, their national pride swelling with each carefully chosen word. The boxing senator took a step forward, closing the distance between them, with the measured approach of a fighter entering the ring for the final round. "But perhaps," he continued, his voice gaining strength like a fighter finding his rhythm, "you would like to see for yourself what this dancing around in shorts actually involves?" The challenge was delivered with such quiet dignity that it took several moments for its full impact to register with the stunned audience. Gasps rippled through the crowd like waves across Manila Bay, as society matrons clutched their pearl necklaces and businessmen loosened their bow ties in the suddenly stifling air. A prominent senator's wife fanned herself nervously with her auction paddle, while her husband reached for his phone to alert his media contacts. The marble floors seemed to vibrate with the collective intake of breath from 200 witnesses to what was becoming the most talked-about moment in Manila high society. Even the hotel staff had stopped pretending to work, their serving trays forgotten as they watched the people's champion issue his quiet ultimatum. "There's a small area behind the hotel, nothing official, just two men showing respect for each other's skills," Manny added, his tone remaining conversational despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. The words carried the weight of 8 world titles and the hopes of 110 million Filipinos, delivered with the same humble confidence that had carried him from poverty to global stardom. Seagal's theatrical composure flickered for the first time, his eyes narrowing as he realized the quiet boxer had just called his bluff in the most public way possible. The businessman who had orchestrated their introduction looked pale, recognizing that his simple celebrity meet and greet had escalated into something that would be remembered long after the charity auction was forgotten. Camera phones lifted like periscopes as the crowd sensed they were witnessing history, their excited whispers creating a buzz that seemed to electrify the humid Manila air. The challenge hung between them like smoke from incense in a crowded church, sacred and unmistakable. This was no longer about boxing or martial arts. It was about honor, respect, and which man would back down when the spotlight burned brightest. As the crowd buzzed with nervous energy around the makeshift arrangement, Manny's mind drifted to the sweat-soaked gym in General Santos City, where his journey had truly begun. The memory hit him like the familiar sting of leather gloves. 10-year-old Manny Pacquiao, barefoot on concrete floors, throwing punches at a heavy bag made from rags and rice sacks. His trainer, a weathered former boxer named Sardo, had grabbed his thin shoulders and said, "Manny, Boxing isn't about being the biggest or strongest. It's about heart, discipline, and never giving up. The humid air of that cramped gym had been thick with the dreams of poor kids who saw boxing as their only escape from the streets. Even then, with holes in his shorts and hunger gnawing at his stomach, he had understood that every punch thrown in anger was a punch wasted. The sound of his fists hitting that makeshift bag had echoed through the tin-roofed building like a prayer, each impact a promise to his mother that someday things would be different. Those early lessons had been carved into his soul with the precision of a master craftsman shaping precious wood. The transition from memory back to the present was as smooth as the combinations he'd perfected over decades of training in gyms across 3 continents. Here in the Shangri-La's opulent ballroom, surrounded by Manila's elite in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, he began the same mental preparation ritual that had preceded every significant fight of his career. His breathing slowed and deepened, each exhale releasing tension, while each inhale brought focus, the technique taught to him by Freddie Roach in the Wildcard Gym's unforgiving heat. The chatter of society reporters and the click of expensive cameras faded into background noise, replaced by the internal rhythm that had carried him through battles with Oscar de la Hoya, Floyd Mayweather, and countless other legends. His calloused hands flexed unconsciously, muscle memory from 10,000 hours of training taking over as his body prepared for what his mind had already accepted. The marble floors beneath his Italian leather shoes felt no different than the canvas of Madison Square Garden or the MGM Grand. In this moment, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and Philippine senators, Manny Pacquiao was exactly where he'd always been, preparing to represent his people's honor with his fists. The physical preparation was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who had watched him train in the brutal Philippine sun of his wildcard gym sessions. He rolled his shoulders in small circles, loosening muscles that had absorbed punishment from some of boxing's hardest hitters, while his feet shifted into a familiar stance that had become as natural as breathing. The expensive fabric of his formal suit stretched across shoulders that had been sculpted by millions of punches, thrown in pursuit of perfection, each fiber bearing witness to a dedication that Hollywood could never replicate. His neck rotated slowly, releasing tension accumulated from hours of political meetings and charity obligations, returning his body to the fighter's state of readiness that lived just beneath his senatorial demeanor. The scent of his cologne mixed with the faint smell of liniment that seemed permanently embedded in his skin, a reminder of ice baths and rub-downs after punishing training sessions. Even his breathing pattern changed, becoming the measured rhythm of a man who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. This wasn't just physical preparation. It was the transformation from politician back to the fighting machine that had conquered 8 weight divisions. The mental aspect of his preparation drew from every moment of adversity he'd faced, from selling cigarettes on Mindanao streets to facing the best fighters in the world under the brightest lights. His mind catalogued every slight, every doubt, every person who had bet against the small Filipino boy who dared to dream beyond his circumstances in General Santos City. The memory of his first professional loss, when he was knocked out in the first round and had to borrow money for the bus ride home, still burned with the clarity of yesterday's pain. He remembered lying on that canvas, tasting blood and defeat, while making a promise to himself that he would never be unprepared again. The discipline that had carried him through 5-mile runs in the Philippine heat, through countless rounds with world-class sparring partners, through the loneliness of training camps away from family, all of it converged in this moment. The wealthy businessman who had introduced him to Seagal continued talking nervously about making arrangements, but Manny was already somewhere else entirely. He was in that sacred space where preparation met opportunity, where a lifetime of dedication would be measured in a few brief moments of truth. The hotel's service elevator descended with mechanical precision toward the basement level, carrying an unlikely cargo of Manila's social elite who had abandoned their charity gala for something far more compelling. The mirrored walls reflected nervous faces, illuminated by smartphone screens, as society reporters frantically typed updates to their editors, their manicured fingers flying across glass keyboards with the urgency of war correspondents. Senator Maria Santos clutched her pearl necklace while whispering rapid-fire Tagalog to her husband, their formal attire suddenly seeming absurd for what was about to unfold in the hotel's loading dock area. The elevator's soft jazz music continued playing, creating a surreal soundtrack as 200 of the Philippines' most powerful citizens descended into the building's industrial bowels. A prominent businessman loosened his bow tie, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning, while his wife fanned herself with an auction paddle she'd forgotten to return. The scent of expensive perfumes mixed with nervous perspiration, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation and disbelief. Even the hotel manager looked pale, realizing his establishment was about to host the most unusual event in its distinguished history. The basement loading dock had been hastily transformed into an impromptu arena, its concrete floors swept clean by efficient hotel staff, who moved with the practiced urgency of event coordinators. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across stacks of banquet supplies and linen carts, while maintenance workers quickly moved equipment to create a small, cleared space surrounded by the accumulated wealth and power of Philippine society. The air was thick with the smell of concrete dust and industrial cleaning supplies, a stark contrast to the sampaguita flowers and crystal chandeliers they'd left behind 3 floors above. Security guards formed an informal perimeter, their radio chatter mixing with the excited whispers of witnesses who understood they were about to see something unprecedented. A catering supervisor directed his staff to position serving tables along the walls, turning them into makeshift viewing platforms for the shorter guests in designer heels and custom suits. The sound of Manila traffic was muffled but audible through the concrete walls, while the building's ventilation system created a low hum that seemed to amplify the electric tension. This was no Madison Square Garden or MGM Grand, just a utilitarian space where 2 very different definitions of combat were about to be tested. The crowd arranged itself in a rough circle around the cleared concrete, their expensive formal wear creating a bizarre contrast against the industrial backdrop of exposed pipes and service equipment. Smartphone cameras rose like periscopes above the sea of heads, their screens glowing as live streams began broadcasting to thousands of viewers across social media platforms. A prominent judge's wife stood on a makeshift platform, created from stacked linen boxes, her diamond tiara catching the harsh fluorescent light as she provided real-time commentary to her Facebook followers. The air was electric with nervous energy as conversations switched rapidly between English and Tagalog, with occasional bursts of Mandarin from Chinese-Filipino business leaders who'd abandoned their charity donations to witness this clash. Hotel security personnel exchanged worried glances as they realized the legal implications of what was about to occur on their property, while the general manager made frantic phone calls to corporate headquarters. A society reporter from Manila Standard balanced on a supply cart, her high heels precariously perched as she broadcast live updates to her newsroom editors. The basement's utilitarian fluorescent lighting created dramatic shadows across faces flushed with excitement and apprehension. Steven Seagal stood in one corner of the improvised ring, his imposing frame somehow diminished by the harsh industrial lighting and concrete surroundings that stripped away Hollywood's flattering cinematography. His theatrical martial arts poses looked less commanding here, among the service equipment and utility pipes that had no appreciation for cinematic mystique or carefully choreographed fight scenes. Several members of his entourage whispered urgently in his ear, their expressions suggesting they were advising him to reconsider this entire affair before it escalated beyond his control. Across the concrete floor, Manny Pacquiao stood quietly with his hands clasped behind his back, his small frame deceptively calm as he surveyed the makeshift arena with the practiced eye of someone who'd fought in venues ranging from small-town boxing clubs to the world's most prestigious sports arenas. The contrast was striking, one man playing a role he'd perfected for cameras, the other simply being himself in any environment where his skills might be tested. A maintenance supervisor finished mopping the concrete floor, ensuring no one would slip during whatever was about to unfold in this most unlikely of venues. The weight of expectation pressed down on both men, like the humid Manila air that even the basement's industrial ventilation couldn't quite dispel. The basement fell into cathedral silence as both men moved toward the center of the cleared concrete space, their footsteps echoing off industrial pipes and service equipment with surprising resonance. Manny's Italian leather shoes clicked softly against the polished floor, while Seagal's heavier boots created a more dramatic sound that seemed amplified in the utilitarian space. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast stark shadows across their faces, stripping away any pretense or performance as reality replaced the theater of their earlier encounter. A prominent senator's wife held her breath, her diamond bracelet catching the light as her hand trembled with anticipation of witnessing something unprecedented. The air was thick with the scent of concrete dust and nervous perspiration, while the distant hum of Manila traffic provided an oddly comforting soundtrack to this surreal confrontation. Hotel security guards positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter, their radios crackling with nervous chatter as they realized they were about to witness either a diplomatic disaster or a moment of truth. The weight of 200 witnesses pressed against the fighters like atmospheric pressure before a typhoon strikes the Philippine Islands. Seagal assumed his familiar martial arts stance, legs spread wide and hands positioned in the classical poses that had defined his screen persona for 3 decades of action films. His movements were deliberate and theatrical, designed for cameras that weren't rolling and audiences that existed only in his imagination, while his ponytail swayed with each calculated gesture. "This is what real combat looks like," he announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the same gravitas he'd used to intimidate countless movie villains in Hollywood studios. The businessman who had orchestrated their meeting shifted uncomfortably, realizing his social introduction had escalated into something that would be analyzed and debated across Philippine media for weeks. Several society reporters raised their smartphones higher, ensuring perfect angles for the footage that would soon flood social media platforms across Southeast Asia. Manny remained motionless in the center of the concrete floor, his stance natural and unforced, like a cat preparing to strike with lethal precision. The contrast between performance and authenticity had never been more apparent than in this basement arena beneath Manila's most prestigious hotel. Without warning or ceremony, Seagal launched forward with a complex combination of martial arts techniques, his large frame moving with surprising fluidity across the polished concrete surface. His strikes were elaborate and visually impressive, incorporating elements from multiple disciplines in a display that would have looked magnificent on film with proper lighting and camera angles. The crowd gasped as his movements created dramatic shadows against the basement walls, while several witnesses instinctively stepped backward to avoid the sweeping arcs of his arms. A hotel manager covered his eyes, unable to watch what he was certain would result in serious injury to the diminutive senator from Sarangani province. The air was filled with the sound of Seagal's breathing and the whisper of expensive fabric as his suit jacket stretched across his shoulders during the elaborate attack sequence. For a moment, it seemed as though decades of Hollywood mystique and carefully crafted screen presence might overwhelm the simple boxer who stood waiting in the center of the makeshift ring. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in stark relief as two very different philosophies of combat prepared to collide. Then, with the understated precision that had made him legendary in 8 weight divisions, Manny Pacquiao threw a single left jab that cut through Seagal's elaborate choreography like a blade through silk. The punch was neither dramatic nor theatrical, just a fundamental boxing technique executed with 40 years of refinement, traveling perhaps 18 inches before connecting with surgical accuracy. The sound that followed was unlike anything the wealthy witnesses had expected. Not the exaggerated impacts of movie fight scenes, but the authentic crack of leather meeting flesh that echoed through the basement with devastating finality. Seagal's complex martial arts sequence collapsed instantly, his theatrical momentum transformed into awkward stumbling as he tried to process what had just happened to his carefully constructed mystique. The crowd's collective gasp seemed to suck all oxygen from the basement, while camera phones captured the exact moment when Hollywood illusion met Philippine reality. A society reporter's mouth fell open as she realized she was witnessing the deconstruction of a legend, while her fingers automatically continued recording what would become the most viral video in Manila's social media history. The single punch had lasted perhaps 1/10 of a second, but its impact would reverberate through both men's legacies forever. Steven Seagal stood frozen in the center of the concrete floor, his theatrical martial arts stance completely abandoned as his mind struggled to process what had just occurred. The elaborate choreography that had defined his screen persona for 3 decades lay shattered around him like broken glass, while his ponytail hung limp against his shoulders in the harsh fluorescent lighting. His left cheek bore a red mark that would soon blossom into a bruise, physical evidence of the gap between Hollywood illusion and authentic combat skill that no amount of movie magic could bridge. The basement's industrial ventilation system seemed louder now, filling the silence as 200 witnesses held their collective breath, waiting to see how the action star would respond to this moment of truth. A prominent businessman loosened his bow tie completely, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized he was watching the real-time deconstruction of a carefully crafted public image. Hotel security guards exchanged worried glances, their radios crackling with nervous chatter as they contemplated the international incident unfolding in their basement loading dock. The scent of concrete dust mixed with expensive cologne and nervous perspiration, creating an atmosphere thick with the weight of shattered illusions and uncomfortable revelations. The crowd began to murmur in hushed Tagalog and English, their expensive smartphones capturing every nuance of Seagal's stunned expression as he touched his face where Pacquiao's jab had connected. A society reporter from Manila Standard whispered rapid updates into her phone, her voice barely audible above the building's mechanical hum as she described the scene to her editor in real time. "He's just standing there," she reported, "like he can't believe what happened. 30 years of movie fights, and one real punch changed everything." Several witnesses shifted uncomfortably in their formal wear, recognizing that they were seeing something profoundly human. The moment when a man's carefully constructed identity collides with undeniable reality. A prominent judge's wife clutched her pearl necklace, her diamond tiara seeming absurdly out of place in this utilitarian basement where authentic truth had just demolished cinematic pretense. The air was electric with nervous energy as cameras continued recording, documenting the exact moment when Hollywood mystique met Philippine boxing precision. Even the hotel staff had stopped pretending to work, their serving trays forgotten as they witnessed the quiet destruction of a legend's carefully maintained facade. Manny Pacquiao remained in his natural stance, his expression unchanged, despite having just delivered one of the most significant punches of his career, not because of its power, but because of what it revealed. His calloused hands returned to their familiar position behind his back, the gesture of humility that had endeared him to millions of Filipinos who saw in him the embodiment of their national character. There was no celebration in his dark eyes, no triumph or vindication, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who had defended not just his own honor, but the dignity of authentic achievement. The senator from Sarangani province had proven his point with characteristic understatement, allowing his skills to speak louder than any words could have conveyed. A maintenance supervisor finished mopping the far corner of the basement, his routine work providing an oddly normal counterpoint to the extraordinary drama unfolding just meters away. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum, casting everything in stark relief as the two men stood in the aftermath of their brief but decisive encounter. This was not the explosive confrontation that Hollywood would have choreographed, but something far more powerful, the quiet triumph of substance over style, authenticity over artifice. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes as Seagal finally lowered his hands, his theatrical poses abandoned in favor of something approaching genuine humility that few had ever seen from the action star. His voice, when it finally came, lacked the gravitas and confident drawl that had narrated countless movie trailers, replaced by something smaller and more human than the crowd had expected. I underestimated you," he said quietly, the admission carrying across the concrete floor with more impact than any of his earlier boasts or challenges. Several society matrons fanned themselves with auction paddles, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of witnessing such an unexpected moment of vulnerability from someone they'd only known as an invincible screen presence. A prominent businessman reached for his phone to call his media contacts, recognizing that this story would dominate Philippine headlines for weeks while potentially destroying or rehabilitating both men's public images. The basement's industrial setting seemed to amplify the authenticity of the moment, stripping away any possibility of performance or pretense as two very different men faced the truth about their respective legends. The revolution was complete, not through violence or humiliation, but through the simple revelation that real skill, earned through decades of dedication, would always triumph over manufactured mystique. The tension in the basement began to dissolve as Manny Pacquiao took a deliberate step forward, his movement calm and measured like a diplomat approaching a peace negotiation. His weathered hand extended toward Seagal, not in challenge, but in the universal gesture of respect that transcended cultural boundaries and personal conflicts. "Mr. Seagal," he said softly, his Visayan accent coloring the words with genuine warmth. "We are both students of combat, just on different paths." The fluorescent lights overhead seemed less harsh now, casting softer shadows across both men as the moment transformed from confrontation to reconciliation. A society reporter lowered her smartphone, recognizing that some moments were too sacred to be reduced to viral content or social media fodder. The concrete floor that had witnessed such a dramatic revelation now became neutral ground, where two very different legends could find common understanding. Hotel security guards relaxed their postures, their radio chatter dying down as they sensed the crisis was resolving itself through dignity rather than escalating into something requiring emergency intervention. Steven Seagal stared at the extended hand for several heartbeats, his mind visibly processing not just the gesture, but everything it represented about the man who had just humbled him. The red mark on his cheek was already beginning to fade, but the impact on his carefully constructed persona would last far longer than any physical bruise. "Senator Pacquiao," he replied, his voice stripped of its earlier theatrical gravitas and replaced with something approaching genuine respect. "I owe you an apology." His large hand enveloped Manny's smaller one in a handshake that carried the weight of acknowledgement, while cameras captured the moment when Hollywood mystique bent the knee to authentic achievement. A prominent judge's wife dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, moved by the unexpected humanity of watching two public figures choose grace over pride. The basement's utilitarian setting provided the perfect backdrop for this stripped-down moment of truth, where expensive suits and designer gowns couldn't disguise the simple power of one man respecting another's genuine skill. Even the hotel staff had stopped their routine tasks, recognizing they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the charity gala was forgotten. "Your comment about boxing being just hitting and getting hit," Seagal continued, his ponytail swaying as he shook his head in what appeared to be genuine regret, "was ignorant and disrespectful." The admission carried across the concrete floor with more impact than any of his earlier boasts. While 200 witnesses watched the action star transform from caricature into something approaching an authentic human being. A businessman who had orchestrated their introduction finally exhaled, realizing his social event was ending in reconciliation rather than the international incident he'd feared would destroy his reputation. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and nervous perspiration, but also with something else, the unmistakable atmosphere of a moment when pride gives way to wisdom. Manny nodded graciously, his expression unchanged, because he had never sought humiliation or revenge, only the restoration of respect for his sport and his people. A maintenance supervisor continued his routine work in the background, his presence a reminder that life's most profound moments often occur in the most ordinary settings. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bearing witness to a resolution that neither Hollywood screenwriters nor political strategists could have crafted with such authentic power. The handshake evolved into something deeper, as both men recognized they had each learned something valuable in this unlikely basement arena beneath Manila's most prestigious hotel. "Perhaps," Manny suggested, with the diplomatic skill that had served him well in the Philippine Senate, "we could discuss our different approaches to combat over coffee sometime." His invitation carried no trace of condescension despite his decisive victory, only the genuine curiosity of someone always willing to learn from others' experiences. Seagal's response came with a humility that few had ever witnessed from the action star. "I would be honored, Senator, and I promise to listen more than I speak." The crowd began to disperse slowly, their expensive formal wear rustling against the concrete walls as they processed what they had witnessed in this most unexpected of venues. A society reporter pocketed her phone, understanding instinctively that some stories were too important to be reduced to clickbait headlines or social media soundbites. The basement loading dock had become hallowed ground, where two very different men had found a way to transform conflict into mutual respect through the simple acknowledgement of authentic skill and human dignity. As the crowd began their ascent back to the charity gala, the true weight of what had transpired in the basement started to settle like dust after a storm. This had never been about boxing versus martial arts, or even about Steven Seagal's wounded pride and Manny Pacquiao's quiet dignity. It was about something far more fundamental to the human experience. In a world increasingly dominated by social media personas and carefully crafted public images, two men had just demonstrated the eternal conflict between appearance and substance, between what we project and who we truly are. A prominent businessman loosened his bow tie as he climbed the service stairs, realizing he had witnessed a masterclass in authenticity that no business school or leadership seminar could have provided. The fluorescent lights of the basement had stripped away all pretense, revealing the simple truth that genuine skill, earned through decades of dedication and sacrifice, would always triumph over manufactured mystique. A society reporter paused on the landing, her smartphone forgotten as she contemplated how to capture the philosophical dimensions of what she had just witnessed. The lesson was written in the contrast between Hollywood's choreographed violence and the devastating simplicity of a single, authentic punch. The deeper revelation lay not in the physical confrontation, but in how both men had chosen to resolve it. transforming a moment of potential humiliation into an opportunity for growth and understanding. Manny's immediate extension of respect to a man who had publicly mocked him demonstrated the kind of leadership that transcends political office or athletic achievement, the rare ability to elevate others even in moments of personal vindication. His refusal to celebrate or gloat spoke to a wisdom earned not just in boxing rings, but in the school of hard knocks that had shaped his character from the streets of General Santos City to the halls of the Philippine Senate. Seagal's willingness to admit his error and request mentorship revealed that even the most carefully constructed personas could crack open to reveal genuine humanity underneath. A hotel manager watched the last guest disappear up the stairwell, understanding that his establishment had just hosted something more significant than any charity gala or political fundraiser in its distinguished history. The concrete floor that had witnessed their brief encounter now seemed sacred, transformed by the simple power of two men choosing grace over pride. This was the kind of moment that defined character rather than merely revealing it. The implications rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching every witness who had descended into that utilitarian basement expecting entertainment, but finding something approaching enlightenment instead. For the Filipino guests, this had been a reaffirmation of everything they believed about their national hero, that his greatness lay not just in his achievements, but in his character, his ability to represent their values on the world's biggest stages. The foreign dignitaries and expatriate business leaders had witnessed something uniquely Philippine. The concept of kapwa, the shared identity that makes individual victories collective celebrations and personal humiliations community wounds. A prominent judge's wife climbed the stairs in thoughtful silence, her diamond tiara no longer seeming as important as the simple dignity she had witnessed in that basement arena. The lesson was universal, but felt particularly resonant in a country where respect, humility, and quiet strength were considered the highest virtues. Even the hotel staff who had witnessed the encounter would carry this story for the rest of their lives, understanding they had seen something that would be retold in Filipino households for generations. The message was clear. In a world of manufactured images and social media facades, authenticity remained the most powerful force of all. The evening's events would be dissected and analyzed across Philippine media for weeks, but the essential truth was elegantly simple. Genuine respect could only be earned through genuine achievement, and true strength revealed itself not in conquest, but in how victory was handled. Manny Pacquiao had defended more than his boxing skills in that basement. He had upheld the honor of every person who had ever been dismissed because of their size, their background, or their quiet demeanor. His single punch had spoken for every Filipino who had ever been underestimated on the world stage, every immigrant who had been judged by their accent, every underdog who had faced condescension from those who confused privilege with superiority. Steven Seagal's gracious acceptance of his lesson had transformed what could have been a humiliating defeat into an opportunity for redemption, proving that wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected encounters. A society photographer reviewed the images on her camera as she climbed toward the ballroom, knowing she had captured something that transcended mere celebrity gossip to become a study in human nature itself. The basement loading dock had become a classroom where life's most important lessons were taught not through words, but through actions, not through theory, but through the undeniable evidence of authentic skill meeting manufactured mystique. In the end, the deeper message was written in the simplest terms. Truth, like a perfectly thrown punch, cuts through everything else with devastating clarity. The story spread across Filipino social media faster than a tropical typhoon racing across the Pacific, with hashtags like Don Pacquiao Seagal and Basement Bout trending worldwide within hours of the encounter. WhatsApp groups exploded with grainy cell phone footage and first-hand accounts from witnesses, while Facebook timelines filled with proud posts celebrating their national hero's quiet dignity in the face of Hollywood arrogance. International news outlets picked up the story by morning, with CNN, BBC, and ESPN running segments that would cement this basement encounter in boxing folklore forever. The video clips, shot on expensive smartphones by Manila's elite, became the most watched content in Philippine internet history, surpassing even Pacquiao's most famous championship victories. A society reporter who had witnessed the exchange found herself fielding calls from news organizations across 3 continents, her hastily typed notes suddenly becoming source material for documentary filmmakers and sports historians. The basement of the Shangri-La had become more famous than its presidential suite, while hotel management quietly installed a small plaque marking the spot where authenticity had triumphed over artifice. By sunrise, the encounter had transcended local news to become a global meditation on the difference between real achievement and manufactured celebrity. Steven Seagal's public image underwent a fundamental transformation in the weeks following the encounter, as his gracious acceptance of the lesson paradoxically enhanced his reputation more than any action movie ever had. His immediate acknowledgement of error and request for mentorship from Pacquiao revealed a humanity that his screen persona had never conveyed, earning him unexpected respect from critics who had dismissed him for decades. The red mark on his cheek faded within days, but the impact on his character seemed permanent as he began studying actual boxing techniques with the dedication of a genuine student rather than a Hollywood pretender. His social media posts became more humble and introspective, sharing training videos where he practiced basic combinations with the awkward determination of someone learning a new language. A prominent martial arts magazine featured him on their cover with the headline "The Student," celebrating his willingness to admit ignorance and seek authentic instruction. His movie career took an unexpected turn toward more realistic action sequences, as directors recognized that audiences now craved authenticity over elaborate choreography. The basement encounter had stripped away 30 years of accumulated mystique, revealing something more valuable underneath. A man capable of growth and genuine respect for others' expertise. Manny Pacquiao's legend grew even larger, if such a thing were possible, as the story became part of Filipino cultural mythology, alongside his greatest championship victories. Parents across the archipelago used the basement encounter to teach their children about humility in victory and grace under pressure, while boxing gyms from Luzon to Mindanao displayed printed screenshots of the handshake as inspiration for young fighters. The single punch became known as the equalizer, not for its power, but for its ability to cut through pretense and establish truth with devastating simplicity. Philippine schools incorporated the story into their character education curricula, using it to illustrate the difference between authentic achievement and empty boasting. A prominent university commissioned a study on the encounter's impact on national pride, finding that it had reinforced Filipino values more effectively than any government propaganda campaign. Boxing analysts worldwide dissected the technical perfection of that 18-inch jab, noting how 40 years of refinement had compressed into one moment of absolute precision. The basement of a Manila hotel had become a shrine to the power of authentic skill, visited by tourists who wanted to stand where Hollywood illusion had met Philippine reality. Years later, the encounter would be remembered not as a conflict between two men, but as a defining moment in the ongoing battle between substance and style, authenticity and artifice in modern culture. Documentaries would feature the grainy smartphone footage alongside interviews with witnesses, creating a historical record of the night when social media captured something genuinely profound rather than merely viral. The friendship that developed between Pacquiao and Seagal became legendary in its own right, with their coffee meetings becoming regular fixtures in Manila's social calendar, as the action star genuinely embraced his role as student to the boxing master. Philippine tourism boards began featuring the Shangri-La basement in their promotional materials, marketing it as the place where visitors could witness the exact spot where respect triumphed over arrogance. A prominent sculptor was commissioned to create a bronze memorial depicting the handshake, installed in General Santos City as a reminder that their hometown hero's greatest victory might not have been won in any championship ring. The story became required reading in journalism schools as an example of how authentic moments could cut through the noise of manufactured content to create lasting cultural impact. In the end, the basement encounter had proved that in an age of artificial everything, genuine human moments still possess the power to move hearts, change minds, and remind people of what truly mattered in the endless contest between who we pretend to be and who we really are. In that Manila basement, two worlds collided. Hollywood illusion met Philippine reality, and authenticity won with a single punch. This moment proved that genuine skill, earned through decades of dedication, will always triumph over manufactured mystique. What did you think of this incredible encounter? Subscribe and share your thoughts below.